also published several works on German idealists and Meister Eckhart. Most notably, or most recent, notably in 2013, for example, he published the monograph Über das Dasein Albertus Magnus on the Metaphysik des Idealismus. And in 2004 as well, he published Sein als Freiheit, die idealistische Metaphysik Meister Eckhart and Johann Gottlieb Fichtes. And he was also the editor of several volumes on these topics and these authors as well. So we give the floor to you.
Yes, thank you very much for the kind introduction. I'm going to speak today about Schelling's light philosophy in relationship with some mystics, but the question is gonna be first whether there is a kind of break in Schelling's development. So Proteus of philosophy. This is how Schelling has often been called by scholars. Proteus, this is a sea god in the ancient Greek mythology who used to change his shape to avoid being recognized as the person he really was. Similarly, it is said that Schelling changed his philosophical mind again and again, accommodating his own position to the latest development in philosophy. Now, I do not think this approach is a right one. Rather, there has been, to put it with Walter Erhard's words in a classical article from the 70s, it has been only one Schelling, nur ein Schelling. I will argue in what follows that one basic position underpins all of Schelling's philosophical contributions between 1790, which is the date of his very first publication, and 1846, that is the year, I hope, which he delivered his last lectures at the University of Berlin. On the other hand, there is no doubt that Schelling was always reacting to the most important achievements in the philosophy of his time. He was always formulating his own thesis by using the conceptual framework characteristic of some other authors, such as Kant, Fichte, Jacobi, or Bada, just to mention the better-known cases. Nevertheless, he was never just accommodating any particular philosophical context, but rather defending his own philosophical position in a permanent dialogue with others. He was constantly reformulating his one basic philosophical position through speaking and reasoning, which is actually the original meaning of the Greek word dialogos, that is to say, dialogos. He was always dialogically persistent. This is the title of the book on Schelling's and mystics I am publishing, and I hope will be finishing this year. Now, this one fundamental position underpinning all of Schelling's philosophical contributions throughout his career is, and we'll argue today, a form of Platonism. It is a well-known fact that the young Schelling, along with his friends Hegel and Hölderlin, read Plato's dialogues during their time at the Tübinger Stift, that is, during his philosophical theological studies from 1790 to 1794, when he was between 15 and 19 years old. In 1804, he still called Plato the head and father of true philosophy. Even though Schelling in his late philosophy repeatedly refers to Aristotle, his position, as we will see, clearly remains a fundamentally Platonic one. It might be true that the late Schelling, as Thomas Bochheim puts it, studied Aristotle devotedly. Yet, he continued to think in an eminently Platonic manner. In a similar way, it is true that mysticism played a fundamental role in the development of Schelling's thought from start to finish. In the scope of my research project entitled The Eternal Concept of the Individual, a historical, philological, and systematic study of mystical reason and its reception in Schelling's work, funded by the German Research Foundation, Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, some results have been achieved that can be summarized as follows. Firstly, Schelling became acquainted with Johannes Tauler's mystical works very early in his career, most probably during his studies at the Tübinger Stift. He read Tauler's work in the edition published by the pietist Philipp Jakob Spener, which appeared in 1685, also containing 14 German sermons by Meister Eckhart, presented as works by Tauler, as well as the pseudo-Taulerian Book of Spiritual Poverty, which Schelling demonstrably knew and highly valued. Secondly, around 1810 and 1811, he came across the Basel print of Tauler's sermon, first published in 1521 and reprinted in 1522, which contains 68 German sermons by Meister Eckhart, who is presented, Meister Eckhart, as the true author of these sermons for the very first time in the history of Tauler's editions. Undoubtedly, Schelling is presupposing some sermons by Eckhart contained in this Basel print in some crucial passages in the ages of the word, it is to say between 1811, 1815, and the Erlangen lecture from 1821, but it is accepted that he would write in this lecture even from 1811 onwards. Thirdly, Schelling's implicit references to Jakob Böhme, Friedrich Christoph Oettinger, Philipp Matthäus Hahn, and Immanuel Swedenborg, as they can be easily attested in the Essay on Freedom, 1809, and the Stuttgart Private Lectures from 1810, indicate a move away from mysticism, specifically from the Platonic, Neoplatonic mysticism characteristic of Meister Eckhart, rather than a move towards mysticism. For he was now using these authors he had long known, Böhme, for instance, since his time as extraordinarius at the University of Jena, to reformulate positions he had hitherto maintained under the influence of Meister Eckhart, particularly the central thesis of his philosophy of identity. Everything, the most important influence of Meister Eckhart's sermons we find in Schelling's philosophy of identity, and not thereafter. Of course, also in some passages in the ages of the world, but the most similar position we find in Schelling with regard to Meister Eckhart, we find in his writings regarding the philosophy of identity. However, rather than viewing it as a critique or correction by Schelling of his original Platonic thesis, we should consider this late process more as a completion of Eckhart's and Schelling's original positions. By emphasizing the significance of the concrete existential, meaning historical, perspective characteristic of Böhme, Oettinger, Hahn, and as we saw today, Swedenborg, all of whom were interested in a critique of an idealistic, abstract account on religious matters. Now, maybe there has been no change in Schelling's original Platonic position. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that in his latest writings, particularly with his positive philosophy, we find theses that apparently reject fundamental aspects of his philosophy of identity, particularly, the primacy of analyticity of logical existence that had been crucial for him up to about 1809. It is also important for the philosophy of nature, I would say. We can speak about it thereafter. Analyticity, that means Schelling's thesis that only analytic statements, as those whose truth or falsehood is in no way dependent upon facts at all, tell us how things, maybe not factually, though really are. We find the crucial passage in Schelling's so-called Würzburg system, as of his lectures in Würzburg on philosophy of identity and philosophy of nature, from 1804-1806. In the case, he wrote, I quote, of vulgar knowledge, we find, for instance, with Kant, the following opposition. Either my knowledge attains the objective real world, it is then not true in an absolute manner, but it's only a synthetic knowledge, or my knowledge is true in an absolute manner, but it does then not attain the objective world, having only a merely subjective meaning, because in this case, I do not know anything about the world itself, but only about my own thought. If knowledge attains reality, it is then not an absolute knowledge. And if its knowledge is absolute, it does then not attain reality. This is the way the vulgar logic argues, which is the point of view of Kant and his entire philosophy, which looks for reality only through synthetic knowledge. But this sort of knowledge is really, that means from the higher point of view of true philosophy considered, even a kind of knowledge without any reality at all, unquote. Schelling is telling us here that we have to avoid experience in order to know how things are. So we have to know experience in order to know how things are, maybe not factually, but nevertheless, really or authentically. I'm not forgetting about Schelling's philosophy of nature. The underlying tacit premise here is, of course, that the world as it normally appears, that is, as it is factually, is not real, which is, of course, a clearly Platonic thesis. Daily experience shows us a world dominated by mere conditionals. Everything needs some condition, let's say some reason, or to put it in Middle High German words, some Warum, for it to happen or even to exist. Generally speaking, things just happen because or in virtue of some kind of hypothetical condition. Schelling calls such knowledge, that is the knowledge of the world as it generally is, the vulgar knowledge, das gemeine Wissen. It is, of course, a particular translation of the word gemeine, meaning the same like mean in English. And he also speaks in the same passage of the vulgar knowledge, die gemeine knowledge, referring to Kant as to someone who, I quote, looks for reality only through a merely conditional synthetic knowledge, unquote. Such a synthetic knowledge is insofar vulgar, gemein, mean, as it cannot but refer to things needing an external reason in order to happen, therefore not happening, not existing in virtue of their inward necessity, not in virtue of their own essence, not in virtue of what they are in themselves, that is to say, not in virtue of their own concept. Reason, meaning absolute reason, does not depend on mere reasons, now plural, to know how the world is real. Let me quote the continuation of the passage I have just quoted. If I argue in the sense of absolute reason, then I will know both in an unconditional way and in a way stating how things really are. Reason pertains to a knowledge in which we do not have to go beyond thought, not beyond the identity of a concept, but we are nevertheless also determining thereby at the same time and in an immediate way, which is the thing that corresponds to the concept. That is, the object, and quoting, that is, the object considered as it is known by reason is of a kind that its reality is determined by the principle of identity alone. With regard to such an object, the following statement is true. The existence of such an object comes about because of the concept alone, in an immediate way. Such an object has thus its affirmation in its own concept. The absolute alone is therefore the true object of rational knowledge, for only in this case the principle of identity, determining how a thing is in the concept, is at the same time determining how the things exist. We understand now what is the true and real meaning of the statement A equals A, unquote. All this was a sentence, a quotation from Schelling. This analytical thesis is clearly nothing but an expression of the so-called ontological argument. Of course, the argument by Anselm, which Thomas Aquinas and later on Kant criticized, is not exactly the same we find with Schelling, for he's not trying to prove that there is God, but rather that the divine being of things, including the divine being of nature, is nothing but their essential being as expressed not by the mere representation merely appearing to someone in order to get something else, but by the concept of the thing itself, having an inward power to bring this thing to existence. So an inward power bringing the thing to be as it actually is. The concept of something expresses what this thing itself is, whereas the mere representation of it, Middle High German would say Bilde, no? Representation, it is the same concept like Bilde in the word of Meister Eckhart. I think this is pretty great. The mere representation of it merely means what the thing is in relation to or with respect to something else as its reason, its Varumben. Depending on some reason or Varumben for knowing the thing, I would never be able to see the authentic being as what this thing is by itself or wirelessly, which means I would never be able to know this thing analytically or identically. This is the kind of logical existent characteristic of Schelling's philosophy by 1804, which is by no means a novelty of the so-called philosophy of identity, but can be already found in Schelling's previous writing, even his Timaeus Commentary from 1794. I'm not going to discuss this assertion. Now, what has become of such logical existence in Schelling's late philosophy? The self-moderation of idealism in Schelling's late philosophy. This is notably the title of Thomas Buchheim's Habilitationsschrift from 1992, the Selbstbescheidung of Idealism und Schelling Spätphilosophie. Although Schelling occasionally uses the term self-moderation, Selbstbescheidung himself, it did emerge in a different context. In a letter to Bada, dated on the 16th of December 1797, Jacobi described his own philosophy as a modest one, bescheiden, in opposition to Fichte's immodest thinking. I quote from Jacobi's brief to letter to Bada. I recently told a friend that the title of my philosophy would be I moderate myself, ich bescheide mich. Well, he responded, then you can call your opponents the immodest ones. Indeed, this is almost the only difference between Fichte's followers and myself, unquote. On the 3rd of January 1798, so 3 weeks thereafter, Bada responded to this as follows. I consider myself a disciple of your modest philosophy, meaning a disciple of the critique of what he refers to as the egoistical philosophy of idealism, I quote. Bada now. I do not agree with Fichte at all, and I increasingly distance myself from that egoistical philosophy, which calls the moral law a product of my eye, and thus, instead of making me a judge who must forget himself before the law and the lawgiver everywhere, risk making me lose sight of the lawgiver above me, who is not placed outside of me, as I must always remain rooted in him. And if this is a quotation from Bada, and if this, as Mr. Schelling says, means liberating humanity from the terrors of the objective world, then I must honestly confess that I prefer the old fear of God 1,000 times over this Kantian idealism, which is only more consistently and honestly carried out. Unquote. It is often overlooked that Bada, who enjoyed a very friendly relationship with Schelling in Munich from 1806 onwards, conceived his own philosophy right from the start and until the end of his life as a critique of idealism, including, as we saw even now, Schelling's idealism. Against Schelling's attempt, as Bada cites from Schelling's treatise on the eye as the principle of philosophy in the passage I have just quoted, to liberate humanity from the terrors of the objective world, Bada sought to recognize the objective word, meaning the word given by God, and therefore not posited by the subject. Schelling's later formulation revealed his attempt to address Bada's and Jacobi's critique of idealism. He actually altered his formulation to clarify that his philosophy was not immodest in that way, that he did not consider the eye to be the heart of philosophy. This attempt is evident in his advocacy for ecstatic knowledge as the only possible form of true knowledge in the Erlangen lectures. Ecstasis, according to Schelling as well as to the ancient Greek etymology, means being placed outside oneself, abandoning oneself to let things be as they are really. Precisely in this context, he interprets Plato's wonder, Taumachen, in German Staunen, as such an ecstasis, in which the subject shrinks back, so weicht zurück, from the thing as it is in itself. So, did the late Schelling, through such a critique of Fichte's eye, reclaim the objective word for his philosophy, abandoning thereby his originally Platonic idealistic way of thinking? This seems to be the case, as Schelling repeatedly emphasized the centrality of facts in his later writings. Indeed, he seems to have become a sort of positivist, as he explicitly elevates the positive to the center of philosophical thinking. I quote, "The truth is only the positive." He stated unequivocally in his Munich lecture on the system of the ages of the world in the winter term 1827-1828. And he goes on to present the positive as, I quote, "the overcoming of the negative," unquote, defining this negative now in terms of what he had previously elevated to the central point of philosophy as logical existence. The logical systems, he writes, where there is only, I quote, "a purely logical connection of propositions, lack the positive, which is why they cannot be right." It seems, therefore, that the aging Schelling had altered his original position, looking now for physical existence and existence that's beyond the concept. If this is the case, one could indeed speak of a break in Schelling's philosophical development. Now, I do not think that that's true. First, we must ask what the late Schelling means by the facts. Abstract logical existence follows directly and necessarily from the concept itself, as we have seen before when speaking about Schelling's philosophy of identity. Now he writes, I quote, "This consequence emerges from the cause without a deed. It follows from the concept by," unquote. Therefore, what exists not merely logically, but as a matter of fact, must be brought into reality through a deed. This is the central thesis now. The language itself establishes such a relationship between deed and fact, not only in German, Tat und Tatsache, but also in Latin, factum as the perfect passive participle of facere, as well as in English, where fact, from Latin factum even, and deed are connected both etymologically and conceptually, as to do, facere, refers to performing an action, and deed refers to the executed action, the action as what has been done. Facts, in this sense, do not merely refer to what is there, wherever it may come from, but to what exists in connection with a deed, more precisely said, with someone's deed. For a deed is always the action of a particular individual at a particular moment in time, so that a fact is, as such, a historical event. A fact simply occurs, German "sie kommt halt vor," but it could have turned out differently, as the fact, being as such connected with a deed, is ultimately connected with someone's voluntary decision or choice. Positive philosophy, therefore, dealing as such with facts, can be nothing but historical philosophy. In contrast to what Schelling's philosophy of identity had asserted, true knowledge as knowledge about historical facts as mere contingencies can only be a synthetic one, insofar as the fact depends on a voluntary deed of a particular individual, which, as such, may or may not occur. Facts, I quote, cannot be known in advance, thus not a priori. True thinking is, Schelling writes, I quote again, thinking that goes beyond itself, unquote. And he then adds, who cares anymore about mere thinking, unquote. In this context, he offers a new interpretation of Plato's concept of wonder, thaumazo, as the foundation of philosophy, arguing that it testifies to Plato's interest in facts as what lies beyond the necessity characteristic of the concept itself, and thus, being unexpected as such, surprises or evokes wonder. For wonder, Schelling's right, only occurs with the unexpected, the historical, with an action, not with a priori knowledge. The rationalist pathos is not wonder, but the opposite. He wants to put an end to things, unquote. This new position is reflected in Schelling's apparently changed stance on the ontological argument. I'm not going to discuss this, but we can talk about it after. Because he changed his stance about the ontological argument, which is clear because now he's interested in historical facts as depending on a voluntary decision of someone, of anyone. Now, if we are talking about a fact that is also additionally really, that it is an authentic fact, then the deed found in it consists in the individual voluntary decision for the absolute, the unconditioned. In other words, for that which is right by itself or from within, and as such is to be done. If no individual's deed occur, we can only speak of an abstract existence. If the voluntary decision does not align with the absolute, that is, with what ought to be, then the fact would not be an authentic one. It would be a reality that is not real. The deed establishing factual and authentic existence can only occur, according to Schelling, by overcoming what is not, also by overcoming what is not. a known being that is to be overcome, a known being that in some way or another still is thus, paradoxically enough, necessary condition for the factual existence of the unconditioned. In this context, Schelling often referred to a distinction made by Plutarch between me on einai and uk on einai. Unlike the uk on, which does not exist at all, me on refers to a given nothing. Me on exists, though it exists without being, meaning without being as it ought to be. In Schelling's essay on freedom, such me on appears as evil. The deed that establishes actual and authentic existence can only occur by overcoming such a me on, the evil, which in this sense serves as the condition to be overcome for the deed base that is factual existence of the absolute as a particular individually existing being. This is an absolutely central aspect in the theology of Swabian pietism, which played a crucial role in the development of Schelling's thought at that time. I quote, also from Oettinger: "If there were no darkness in the creature, it could not become perfect," unquote. The perfect being of the creature. In Schelling's terms, we would say the factual existence of the creature comes, and not only of the creature, by the way, comes about only in the struggle against me on as a given condition, and ultimately by overcoming it with the victory over the condition, that as a deed carried out against the given condition. For as Jacob Böhme, of whom both Oettinger and Hahn in this aspect were ultimately depending, had explicitly stated, I quote from Böhme now, "If everything were in sweet gentleness, where would be the movement, the kingdom, the power, and the glory? Therefore, we have often said that wrath is a root of life," unquote. This is precisely the same position of Schelling's late philosophy, when he, to give you an example, writes in his introduction to philosophy, I quote, "All immediate being is an abstract one as long as had not withstood opposition. Only through opposition it can be elevated to its authentic essence," unquote. And similar statements can already be found in the Stuttgart private lectures from 1810, "Without opposition there is no life," we read there, as well as in the essay on freedom he had published a year earlier. I quote, "Where there is no struggle, there is no life." I'm coming to an end, please just remain. The thesis just outlined, with the 18 Schelling adapted from Böhme and the theology of Swabian pietism, applies not only to creatures, but even to God himself. God, the authentic, existing, personal God, is not a being that directly and necessarily posits his own existence because of the virtue of his concept as such, because such a being would be merely an abstract one. Instead, God ought to establish himself, and he ought to do so through a deed based solely on his own voluntary decision, a deed consisting in overcoming a given known being, meaning the Platonic meon as what ought not to be. That is the given evil, which indeed, Schelling says, as a principle to be overcome belongs to God's very essence. This is why Schelling says, why Plato defines God, the absolute, not as God itself, not as good itself, as if it were an absolute already fulfilled from eternity, but as better itself. Therefore, as a good being that through his personal deed, as a good who has actually proved himself to be better than evil as what ought not to be. The absolute that has passed and is still passing every day the test of non-being. Being better itself, God is not being itself, but rather the Lord of being. As a being that rules over being, he is an overbeing or even a superbeing. He, the factually existing personal God, is in this sense, paradoxically enough, a relative absolute, a conditioned unconditioned, since to actually exist as he is authentically, he requires the existence of another to rule over it. As overbeing, God not only overcomes evil, but he also transcends his initially given being, that is, his Lord, even over his supposedly own being as a given one. Only by performing a deed based on his voluntary decision, God becomes God both factually and authentically. As Schelling writes, I quote, God as such is not a substance. His being as God is not different from his deed, unquote. And this is, according to Schelling, precisely how God defines himself in Exodus 3:14. Achia asher achia, using the imperfect and referring thereby to something not finished, not perfected, but still to be fulfilled. That is, not presenting himself as being, as if he were something definitively given, but as something that is to become. That is something that is to be brought into actual and authentic existence through his own deed. I will be who I will be, who I want to be, which is the clause Schelling uses to translate God's statement in Exodus 3. Okay, so stand up and fight to keep both factually and authentically existing as the one you, again, you yourself, are. Thank you for your attention.
So it's time for the discussion. I think the first hand that was raised was yours.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Professor, for your talk. Yeah, very interesting. I even if I don't necessarily immediately agree with this thesis that Platonism underlies the entirety of Schelling's philosophy, I think you deliver a very compelling argument. I was wondering, perhaps this stems from a sort of misunderstanding on my part relative to your talk, but in this last section on the absolute and how there's a deed, if I understood correctly, on the part of God to, in a way, overcome this specific, this determined nothingness. That's kind of, yeah, as a deed on the part of God, God is becoming. If there is some sort of processual understanding of God in this respect, don't we, doesn't Schelling end up with slightly manichaeistic understanding of divinity as not one absolute that is the ultimate principle of reality, but that struggles with an evil principle that and if rather shouldn't we understand this more and these determinations as determinations that are expedient from the perspective of finite cognition as opposed to ontological assertions concerning the being of God itself.
It's of course a nice question. It is a process. I think God is nothing substantially. I quote two passages, I think, by Schelling. So it is a process. There is no finished God. And in the case of God, we know He's going to get the victory. over this, say, me on, which is a reality. This is Manichaeism is the problem everyone always mention in this context. And well, in a sense, he would say this is not only for Schelling, but also for the whole tradition, Neoplatonism. They would say, well, first of all, it is a reality, evil, but it is a reality which is not, it is a reality that it is a good thing, so to speak, since it serves the life of God and the life of everyone, you know. If evil weren't there, how does Böhme ask, if everything were in sweet gentleness, where would be the movement, the kingdom, the power, and the glory? So in this sense, evil is not only evil, I would say. This is the only thing I can say, but you know, after this conference, everyone is going to keep speaking about this problem because it's, you know.
Okay, I think the order for the questions will be you and then you and then you. Yeah, so we can go.
Thank you for your presentation. I agree with you.
I'm happy to hear that.
But I have a question.
It's a problem.
Let's switch in the late writings. Schelling speaks from deed and facts. And he connects this with historical knowledge. But what exactly means here historical fact? Because God is not a historical fact, although if he is in a process. And how would you explain Schelling's speech of historical fact in this case in the positive philosophy and what? Because Schelling says the positive philosophy doesn't start with experience.
Yeah.
They go through experience.
Okay,
And
well,
it's not empirical.
yeah,
That's my point.
in the late philosophy, he says it's a kind of empirical.
Yeah, I know. But
philosophy.
what exactly does it mean?
But even the knowing of God is a sort of empirical knowing, because depending on his own decision, you know what I mean? I'm not a theologian, which is maybe the problem now, but I would say God's existence is a fact in the late philosophy. A fact in this sense of the word, that is something God has to do every day. He said that this is the, how do you say, this is the melancholy. He said, now I mess up the languages, both German and English. He speaks about melancholy, melancholy that clings all finite existence, he said in the essay on freedom. Why? Because, well, in the case of God, he has to fight every day, you know. But since he's God, he's going to win. But we have to fight every day, you know, and sometimes we are not going to win. So I would say, maybe I'm exaggerating, there are some texts there you could present against this interpretation, but now I would say God is a fact as a process, you know what I mean? I really would say this. It's okay for now, isn't it?
You got your question?
Okay, so thank you for your talk. And my question is something to do with some concepts. So just now you mentioned that God's existence is a fact. And then at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned something like knowing things as they really are versus knowing things as they factually are. And then you use the term the factual existence of the unconditioned instead of the real existence of the unconditioned. So my question is, in Schelling's philosophy, does he draw a distinction among the concepts of factuality, actuality, and reality? So the factual, the actual, and the real, are they different? Or if they are really different, then for Schelling, what is the relation among them?
The problem with Schelling is he lived for a long time. That's not a problem. That's a nice thing. He was changing his formulations now and then. You know. So what I'm trying to do is to understand what he thinks, and then to find my own words to express what I think he would have said. This is what I'm trying. The only thing I can do is to try to explain what I myself was thinking when using these terms, For example, you said factuality, actuality, and
reality.
And authenticity, I would also add. So factuality and actuality would be the same in this case. The other was really would be something like authentic. So, and normally, if we say factuality is something about what there is, but not in the case of Schelling, I think it is something about something being done by someone in a free manner, no? And then authenticity would be something happening in accordance to what ought to be. This ought to be coming not from outside, but from the most inwardly part of things, from the concept we would say. Sure, I haven't answered your question completely.
So the concept of being factual for something to be a fact involves the concept of freedom.
For Schelling, no doubt. If we speak the freedom as because there are different concepts of freedom with Schelling, there is also a freedom which is necessity in the past writings, no? But the late Schelling fact has to do with a free decision and a free deed based on a free decision of anyone, which is very important. It has to be a particular person.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Any question?
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I wonder how could we mobilize these arguments of positive philosophy regarding the logical and existence to combat our Hegelian friends? Because it seems to me that there is from the get-go a diverse understanding of what logical and existence means for Schelling and for Hegel in this sense. It is in the background of this confrontation between negative and positive. So basically, Hegelians would not accept that the logical is abstract in the first place, and that existence is once again extra logical, so to speak. And this comes at the very beginning from, it seems to me, a different understanding of existence also in the scholastic tradition. For instance, the school of mental distinction of our ancestor Francisco Suarez would resemble more the Hegelian position, and Schelling more the Thomist position from Thomas Aquinas. Which one will be arguments that a negative philosopher not recognized as such will accept in this challenge, or is that they are speaking completely incompatible languages? Is it that we can mobilize maybe personal human experience to reject the thesis of the all-encompassing domain of the logical, so to speak?
Well, I think the difference between Hegel's concept of logic and Schelling's concept of logic up to the philosophy of identity is not very big. Just not, I think it's similar. At least there are some similar aspects there. Because for Schelling, the logic existence means, say, really existence, no? And a real existence coming from within the concept is a real existence which additionally is real. So I'm sure there are some differences between both, you know, but in the main point, it's okay. I think it's okay. It's not totally different. Now the late Schelling is quite different because he speaks about voluntary decision. Cannot come to find these kind of things with Hegel. For Hegel, this voluntary decision, a decision which is just this way, but could have been another way. Such a kind of decision would destroy the freedom and would destroy the concept, you know. So this is a very big difference. And then, well, the biggest difference between both would be this. For Schelling, there is this melancholy of Lebens. For Hegel, at the end, the concept will win, you know. But everything is wonderful, but not for Schelling. Not for Schelling.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you for the presentation. I'm just going to add something in relation with the end of your speech. That means these quotations of Exodus.
Maybe you have to speak a little louder because I don't know.
Quotation of Exodus to May 14. God has this that means God has fact. But I don't know if Schelling the Greek quotation ego ego one, which presenting God as substance as being.
Right.
I don't know how close Schelling this kind of presenting a God in this quotation, which is very important later in the New Testament and later in the Middle Ages. I don't know, God has fact or God has
Well, fact
has been.
Yeah, fact in the sense of a process, no?
Yes.
So as Schelling defines it.
Mhm.
And of course, the Latin translation of Exodus 3:14 and the Greek translation, both are translations,
Yes.
are not as ideal for him to give the explanation. This is why he referred to the original text of the Bible, no? Achya, Asher, Achya. No, he interpreted this as something which is even not fulfilled. It is an imperfect. Imperfect is, by definition, something which is going to happen, which haven't happened yet. This is why he referred to the original text, I think.
Okay, I think that's we're right on time this time. Unless there's a last minute question, but otherwise, can also of course continue the conversation informally at the break. But I'd like to thank Professor for that very insightful talk as well as the discussion that followed. But for now, I will pass it on to my colleague Rebecca to introduce the next speaker.
Well, maybe to finish the story with the door.
Yes.
I
find a solution.
We just leave it a little open so that we're not being too disturbed.